Reimagine RTD items. Oh, thank you, if that was you, Sebastian, for getting that started for us. So let's go ahead and go into the agenda, and we're going to start off. Brian's going to give us a safety moment.
Good afternoon, Technical Working Group. Hello, Director Williams. The Board of Directors and General Manager Johnson appreciate your continued engagement with us. Quick safety moment for you. Did you know that there's a parade tomorrow? The Denver Office of Emergency Management shared a number of safety tips. I'll give you a couple for tomorrow. Event goers and their loved ones should have an emergency plan in case you need to evacuate during the celebration. Having a central meeting place to meet for reunification will be crucial if technology fails. Couple more. Carry an emergency health information card with you. Stay hydrated and carry snacks to sustain you. And most importantly, maintain a safe distance from parade floats. You are probably not part of the parade. I don't think you're in the parade if you're on this call. So stay shoulder to shoulder with everybody. Have a safe and fun celebration. Go Avs, go.
Those are very useful tips. Thank you,
I also
Brian.
had one about putting your children's name and phone number in their sock if they got separated from you.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Wow.
Sock seems a little extreme, but yeah. Okay, so 3 items at the big level that we're going to cover today. Quick update on the system optimization plan. That has gone to the RTD Board of Directors, which was very exciting, and still some final pieces to come with that, but we want to, and we've sent you some information, but we want to step through some of that. The mobility plan for the future and an update on that, and then an update on the schedule too. So let's go ahead and launch in. This first section, we're just going to review where we've been with the system optimization plan update, if you want to go to the next one. During the last couple of meetings, people have asked about how the system optimization plan is setting the stage for RTD and for the mobility plan for the future. So we put some of these bullet points together to start to frame that out. And really what we're talking about, the system optimization plan really helped to set the new baseline for RTD by ensuring that the service levels that RT is operating are in line with the workforce that's available and the funding that's available to RTD to work with. It clarifies the service priorities, it improves some efficiency, and then of course it sets that framework for the mobility plan for the future, where we start to talk about those sub-regional service councils that were part of the dialogue with the accountability committee and that we've taken some action on, evaluating metrics at that sub-regional level. And then, of course, we've been working on the development of a more robust partnership program that's being implemented as well. And the details of that are we're still working through that, but it's well on its way. So I hope that you all received the email from the team that it included the letter from CEO Johnson about the release of the draft final system optimization plan. And Sebastian, if you want to click on this, this should take us to what we refer to as the system optimization story map. And I'm hoping you all have had a chance to step through this, but I just kind of want us to scroll through what's here and show you what we have. So what we've provided here, you can see Sebastian was nice enough to make us you can see right out of the gate, we have a Spanish version. We start out with the background on what a system optimization plan is, why RTD conducted it, and then we go through a bit about the process that we went through and the evaluation of the 4 alternatives that we looked at and the data that we collected and how we compared and contrasted different investment strategies for the system optimization plan. We were able to get over 1,600 comments on the system optimization plan and have responded to all of those. So you'll see that there was a lot of public and stakeholder engagement. And if you're interested in seeing the comments that were received and then some of the responses, you can click right there where Sebastian's highlighted. One of the other topics that came up a fair bit was just dialogue around Title VI and what that means. So we've put together a white paper that's also out here to help everyone understand what Title VI is, why it's important, how it's taken into account as part of the SOP, and how RTD uses that to ensure that they're meeting those Title VI requirements. Then scrolling down, we've done some analysis on the SOP, and we won't spend a lot of time here, but I love this piece of the tool, this next two pieces of the tool actually. You can, when you have a minute, you can, Sebastian is demonstrating, but you can go in and you can click your particular service sector so you can compare and contrast. If you were interested in how Northeast, say, compared to Northwest, you could compare and contrast metrics for those two service sectors, so you can kind of hone in on the areas that you're particularly interested in. And this gives you, we'll go through this information a little bit more in the next slides. So this is, the first bars there are really the system optimization plan, how well it serves the population, how much bus service is in each of the areas. And then the yellow bars that are down below this start to talk about how the system optimization plan serves jobs across the region. And it's jobs as a whole, and then it's jobs that are considered more in the lower wage jobs, and how well are we serving those jobs, which is an important piece of the puzzle as well. Then if we continue to scroll down, there's a really nifty tool in here. We use a program that's called Remix to develop as part of the development of this. Oh, here, we can go through this. Sorry, we're not quite there. So as you scroll down here, you can see information on and see the illustration of the core routes. You can click on the right and collect all the information on those links about the core routes, the connect routes. As you continue to scroll through, you'll see the commute routes and then the local routes. So you can go and click on those and get all the information on every route and every route that's included in the system optimization plan in those categories. And then this last tool is we used a tool called Remix as part of the development of the system optimization plan. It's a little slow to pop up on my screen, I'm not sure. Oh yeah, there it is. And I just love this tool. This tool allows you to zoom in on an area that you're particularly interested in. You can click on different routes within the area that you're interested in. And then one of the really nifty tools is they refer to her as, she's called Drop Jane, but on the bottom right, you'll see a little female icon there. You can drop Jane into the map and it will show you where Jane can get using the transit system as it's designed. So you can understand, oh, where can Jane, what can Jane access when she's set, well, I can't see the street names there, but where Sebastian just set her. So it's got some, and it looks like it's taking a minute to load because it's actually quite a bit of, there we go. So you can see that the dark blue represents where Jane can travel within 15 minutes. The next lighter blue is where she can get within 30 minutes, 45 minutes. And then if she's on the bus or on the transit system for a travel time of an hour, she can get out to that, to the pink area around town. So I think it's a really interesting tool, and I hope that you will get in and play around with it and look at the routes and information on the routes. And there's lots of good information in there. Let's see, is that Sebastian? Am I seeing a chat?
Yes, I dropped the website in the chat.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. So Sebastian, can you pop out of this and head back over to the, yes, thank you. Okay, so that is the system optimization story map. A couple other things. One of the items that we talked about was the sub-regional service councils and the evaluation that has been done on that. And just as a refresher, I think everybody on this call is aware of those. This map illustrates those sub-regional service councils. And if we scroll down, you'll see very similar bar charts to what we showed you in the story map. And you can start to see how much service is provided in each of the areas. If you want to go to the next one, Sebastian. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so let's talk about this evaluation. First, we have, there's 3 sets of bar charts here. The first, we have population in each of those service sectors on the top left. On the bottom left, we have equity zone population. Then if you click one more time, Sebastian, we'll see the bus service hours per capita and the bus service hours per equity zone capita. And then finally, if we click one more time, you see population access to stops and then equity zone population with access to stops. And once you get into the details here, you can see that there's the different colors of the bars are what was happening in 2021, what was happening in 2021 with 15-minute access to service, what's happening in the SOP overall, and then who has access, how many people have access to 15-minute service when we move to the SOP. And one of the things on the top right that I think is really important that came from this group and the guidance from this group is the focus on that regional backbone network with high quality service. So you'll see that light blue bar, which is that 15-minute access to stops in the SOP, is higher in all of the service sectors than it was in 2021. So we're providing better and more access to that 15-minute high quality backbone network to the region than the 2021 service. Similarly, you'll see that when we talk about the equity zone population, that group is also getting better access to that 15-minute service. So we're happy to see those improvements.
Holly, it looks like we had a quick question from Deborah.
Oh yeah, great. Yes, please.
Yeah, Holly, yes, I did have a question on the preceding slide of the service councils. Could you go back to that?
Yeah.
So I did look through it. So I see downtown called out.
Yeah.
And it doesn't look like, I'm just curious where downtown lives because it's not its own service council from what I saw scrolling through the rest of the presentation.
Yeah, it's not. And you'll see that there is a little footer on each one to tell you what's happening in downtown. The problem with having downtown used to live in Northeast, but it does skew things a bit because there's so much that goes in and is concentrated. You know, this is truly downtown. It's all the routes that circulate along 15th and 17th. So we didn't want to skew any one district with that little concentration of, because it's so isolated to that area. So we pulled that out, but we did provide you information for each of those metrics as a footer in there, so you can see what it is. And if you have a suggestion on where it should live, we got a request during our last meeting to look at city and county of Denver proper, and there's a little resistance to that only because every community may want it. It's not really how people travel. We don't travel just by our municipal boundaries, and we cross regions, so we did not separate that out.
Okay, thank you, Holly.
Mm-hmm.
We have one more question from Ron, Dr. Cobb.
Everybody, thank you. Holly, thanks for this. First of all, on a light note, to Kate Williams' chat comment about the beer made out of ice from the hockey game, that's gross. I've seen what hockey players do on the ice during a game, and I don't want to drink that beer. But seriously, on this slide 7, Holly, I understand the purpose of the comparison to 21 for the SOP, but yeah. I think it would be educational and important to understand how both 21 and the SOP compare to pre-pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we may be able to provide that. I don't know if I have that level of detail for the pre-pandemic, but we might be able to provide that. I think one of the concerns was, you know, pre-pandemic RTD was operating more service than they had money for, and they were operating more service than they had operators for. So it is, you know, it'll be a challenging comparison in that was not a viable solution that was happening at that time. But I understand your thoughts there. Yeah.
Yep. And I understand those caveats, and I think those caveats are important to document and express in sharing that information. But I think I do want to understand, particularly in the equity population access and coverage.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Yep. Yeah, that's a good point. One other thing that, just so everybody's aware, at the board meeting when we presented this information, one of the board members asked about why Boulder was so much higher than some of the others, speaking of the equity zones. And really it has to do with Boulder having a lower equity zone population relatively than the other service sectors. So when we go to the bottom middle, you'll see that Boulder is a fair bit higher on a per capita basis than the other service sectors, and that's why that lives that way. Okay, any other thoughts or questions at the moment? Okay, move us ahead a bit there. Okay, finalizing the SOP. July 13th, the SOP will go to the Operations and Safety Committee. And then on July 26th, we will be asking the board to adopt the SOP at that time. So we're hoping that everybody feels that their comments have been heard, and they feel that with the amount of money and operators that we had to work with, that we have made a good balance of investments throughout the region to try and get people back on board with RTD services and bolster up that ridership and get back on the right track. So, okay, so let's launch into the mobility plan for the future update. So this first slide under here, the first couple slides, we're going to talk about the funding discussion. And there's really more to come on that because Julie's going to help step us through just a larger dialogue about moving forward, some of which is about funding, some of which is about how we handle those recommendations in the mobility plan for the future. And then in between there, we're going to talk about the greenhouse gases, which has come up a lot. And I'm hoping we have some answers and thoughts for you today to answer some of the questions that have come up over the last several months. So fiscal and financial findings. We talked about this at the last meeting, but just to make sure in case anybody was not with us at the last meeting, a reminder that, and this is just what we were talking about, Ron, is that prior to 2020, of course, RTD was operating more service than the allocated resources. When we say allocated resources, we're really talking about the workforce, and we're talking about funding, the amount of money that RTD actually had. And what was happening, they were deferring their state of good repair items in order to operate more service, which was, you know, it's always a balancing act, but it was more than they could continue to do in perpetuity. Long-term financial projections that the Reimagine team has put together indicate that there's limited or no capacity to grow the bus and rail services, to make any substantial capital investments, or to construct or operate any of the unfinished portions of the fast track corridor in the next 20 years. And so one of the things we just flagged is, well, this is not at all what anybody, I think, on the call wants. So there's quite a gap between what we're trying to achieve with RTD services as a region and then what RTD can actually do and support and implement over the next 20, 30 years. So if we go to the next slide, you'll recall that we did start to set the stage for 3 scenarios, financial scenarios, just to have dialogue to compare and contrast and understand what RTD can do if there is no additional money found versus if additional money is identified for RTD. And it's not really so much a matter of picking one, but it is picking a path that we want to support RTD to go down. So the first scenario here is what we're calling the RTD fiscally constrained scenario. The second one is the DRCOG fiscally constrained scenario, and that is really trying to be as consistent as we can with what is in DRCOG's 2050 fiscally constrained plan now. And then we have one that's aspirational, and this aspirational scenario, we're trying to address comments that were around, just our need to have better mobility options moving forward, the need to reduce greenhouse gases. So we said, okay, what if we go really big and have a big investment in transit in the region? So for comparison purposes, we did put in here a rough order of magnitude of daily boardings. In 2020, there was about 200,000, just to give a framework during pandemic, 360,000 in the fiscally constrained plan. That's pre-pandemic levels of ridership there. 620,000 in that fiscally constrained plan, and 800,000 in that aspirational plan. So when we go down, we give some estimates here on how much the operating cost and capacity is. That's that second line there. BRT routes, we've assumed 11 BRT routes, but there's no RTD capital associated with those in that RTD fiscally constrained plan or additional operating costs. We assume those same 11 in the DRCOG fiscally constrained plan. And by the time we go to aspirational, we've doubled that with 22 BRT lines, but RTD does participate in capital and operating for 11 of those routes. We've flagged the facility renovations here. It's worth noting that the team continues to make sure that they have the right number and order of magnitude on these. We know we have some renovations. We know we're going to need some new facilities if demand continues to grow. So you'll see how those change under those three scenarios. Fast Track's investments, you can see what's included in each of those scenarios. Nothing in the fiscally constrained, RTD fiscally constrained plan. The DRCOG plan includes Northwest Rail, peak period service only. And then the aspirational, we've included funding for, or we've included the cost at least for the completion of the full program for Fast Tracks. And then we have other additional capital capacity investments that are also going to be important to the region. Those are included under the DRCOG fiscally constrained and the aspirational, and you'll see there's some very generic descriptions around what those are, but they're very holistically trying to support the regional growth and some efficiencies within the system as well. Then when we get out to aspirational, we get to some of those emerging technology investments, which would be zero emission fleet transitions and generally supporting of new technologies. So all of that at our last meeting, you said, okay, so what does that mean, Holly, for how much additional funding would be needed? And you can start to see the bottom two lines here, start to frame that out. We have cumulative over from now through the 2050 to 2050, a $2 billion deficit in place. And this assumes that if under the RTD fiscally constrained scenario, this assumes that TABOR and the restrictions from TABOR are still in place. The DRCOG fiscally constrained plan, we have about $20 billion. It's assumed that you've removed the TABOR restrictions at that point. And then we're up to 35 billion if we go out to the aspirational. And again, this is cumulative. So the additional sales tax needed, we're saying that the fiscally constrained is no new money needed, but obviously how you deliver service and decisions you have to make are pretty great if that's the case. Moving out to scenario 2, we have a half-cent sales tax under the fiscally constrained, and then the aspirational, you've gone to the full cent on the aspirational scenario. So I want to pause here. I feel like that's a lot of information, and previously we had just very generically talked about the scenarios. So I want to make sure if there's any questions.
So Holly, this is Dan.
Yeah.
It's probably important to mention that in the DRCOG and the aspirational that that we're also debrucing from Tabor as well as suggesting additional sales tax.
Thank you, Dan. David, you have a question?
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Dan.
If we debruced under scenario number 1, how much of the $2 billion deficit is closed?
Yeah, you get close to a break even with that that debrucing, and that is one of our first orders of business and recommendations for the mobility plan for the future, is to go through that process.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Anyone else on this? I know I've said this to you all at our last meeting, but I always feel like this is not the project that we thought. So, but I think it's an opportunity for us to think really critically about what RTD does move forward with and what's really important to the region, understanding the financial constraints that have been outlined here. So if you have questions that pop up, you know, as you've had a chance to absorb this, just put them in the chat, or we can come back around to this. Don't feel like this is the last time to talk about it. Dan's on the phone, and I believe Alyssa or Simon are on the phone as well to answer questions about this information if you have more detailed questions. Another thing I want to make sure that you all are aware of, Dan Gamond and his team at EPS, we have flagged this as sales tax. But they did, in fact, look at a whole array of funding sources. They looked at property tax, they looked at parking fees, they looked at fares, they looked at a whole range of various ways that RTD could close the gap on this deficit. Their recommendation to us was, well, you can try to make headway on piecemealing several different funding sources together, but even when you do that, you're going to be hard pressed to cover this size of gap. So their recommendation for initial discussion with this group is that sales tax probably makes the most sense. But the board did, you know, on the board there was discussion about sales tax versus you know, bringing a variety of sources together, like some of our recent fees and things that we've had. So I throw that out to you as their team has put together some other information for us as well.
And we're also, I mean, we're also evaluating other potential, for lack of a better word, more innovative financing tools and sources in terms of what it might be able to do in terms of generate supplemental income. But as Holly mentioned, the parking charges, the property tax implementation of a 0.5 mil property tax, which we're now allowed to do. They just don't cover any significant portion of the gap. I think property tax covered about 10% of the gap under the baseline. And I guess I left off fare revenues too. Again, a fairly small bump.
Looks like we have a couple other questions. Hugh Lang?
Yeah, thank you, Julie. So I just want to understand the $2 billion, the $20 and the $35 billion. Those are capital one-time deficit, or what is that? That's the dollar amount needed at 2050, or? No,
those are cumulative from through the entire life of the financial analysis that goes through 2050. So by the time from now until 2050, if you say you implement all the items identified in this aspirational scenario, you would find yourself with a $35 billion gap deficit.
Okay, so that's so from today all the way through 2050.
Yes.
In $2050.
The dollars are year of expenditure dollars. Alyssa, if you're out there, we might be getting past my
No, you're right, Holly. Year of expenditure.
Okay. Okay. What does that mean, year expenditure? Like each year has their dollar amount, then you add them up.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right, Huling. It's you're in 2022 and a 2022 dollar is worth a 2022 dollar. And then when you go out to 2023, you've adjusted that dollar, both revenue and the expenditure, to be in a 2023 dollar. So it's not a single, it's changing over time.
Okay. Okay. So then by making that 0.5% or 1% sales tax increase, you'll be able to bring those to cover the gap, either the 20 million or the $35 million gap.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
and you know, we have charts that show every year, you know, it's up, it's down, it's a little high, it's a little low, but over the course of the entire life of the financial plan, these two that we've identified would cover the gap. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. One more question. Sorry. Do you have like a percentage? What is the major? Is it because of the operating costs or is the capital? Or is there like a major? What is the big chunk of that?
Yeah. Right. Alyssa, do you want to weave in here? I mean, operating costs are a big one and they tend to continue to go up, but Alyssa, can you help with that?
Yeah, operations and maintenance costs in all scenarios are the bulk of the costs. They probably represent like somewhere around 70%, I want to say. And then as we get further out in time, some of the stated good repair costs become more significant. And then of course, in the aspirational scenarios, since we have so many more capital projects, capital begins to be more of a material share, but overall in every scenario, operations and maintenance are really the main drivers.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Ron, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks. My friends at RTD won't be surprised by this question, but my understanding is that these financial scenarios are built on an assumption of a significant increase in state of good repair expenditures over the life of this, over kind of above current or previous levels of state of good repair expenditures. And I'm not suggesting that's necessarily a bad thing or an inappropriate decision. But there are choices that are made about sort of the use of available resources. And the choice here, the policy choice here, is to spend more on maintenance, leaving less available to operate service. And I think it's important to inform folks about that choice and the trade-offs and the relative sort of impacts on state of good repair and service levels. And I think that's a missing piece in this table is what would be the impact on state of good repair over time of a different level of maintenance expenditure and more money going to operating. And I'm not saying go back to how it was, but some increment lower than this on state of good repair expenditure. And so just so we all are well informed and well aware of those trade-offs and that policy choice.
Alyssa, maybe something that would help with this conversation would be do you have, because I know we've looked at the charts and you know, you can imagine Alyssa's charts are these giant behemoth spreadsheets and charts, and what percentage are we talking about that is associated with state of good repair?
Can I
say like an annual basis? Do you have a sense of that?
I think it varies a lot because there's a big jump up when we get to, well, can you give me like 5 minutes and I'll pop back in with that?
Yes, you can. We don't even need to do it on the call, but I would like to give people that information. And because I think that gives you the sense of like, of the whole amount expended, are we talking about 70% or are we talking about 10%? You know what I mean? Like, give us is shifting this going to be something meaningful? Or is this going to just, all we're going to do is, you know, what happens when you defer your state of good repair is you are less reliable service, your buses break down more, they require more maintenance, it costs more, like that's what's happening through that process. We certainly don't want to get to, we're trying to be more reliable, so we'd like to not do that. But, you know, as we know from past, that has been the case for RTD where they have deferred some of that.
Yes, we
Thanks,
can get
Alyssa.
that. No problem.
That'd be great.
Jean, looks like you have a question.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. And Holly, thanks so much for this presentation. This is really important information, and it's laid out really well. My question is related to scenario number 2, the DRCOG fiscally constrained scenario. So as I understand it, a lot of us have been in conversations at the staff level with DRCOG about the 2050 RTP and potential mitigation measures that might be put in place to meet GHG targets as mandated by the state. And so from what I'm reading here, what's included in that 2050 RTP is transit service to the tune of $20 billion, which is not, for all intents and purposes, going to be funded without a sales tax or some sort of means to raise those dollars. So, and maybe this is also a question for Ron, but I just wonder, like, does this then mean that adjustments need to be made to the DRCOG fiscally constrained plan at this point, like looking at these very real numbers and limitations for additional service?
Ron, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, thanks, Jean. At this point, we don't believe so. You know, our 2050 RTP is a 30-year plan. We're evaluating very closely this. None of this isn't quite final yet, and it won't be by the time we update the plan. And, you know, we have many assumptions in the financial constraint determination for the regional transportation plan. And I think assuming for planning purposes at this point, debrucing RTD is a reasonable assumption at this point. You know, I think that's a strategy. We've got other financial strategies included in the 2050 RTP. I think what's really important here is that the really key pieces that we're kind of structuring potential mitigation measures around the new BRT corridors are also included in RTD's current fiscally constrained proposal or concept right now, right? Those new BRT corridors and their commitment to operating those BRT corridors. So I think those key pieces are still in place and still very relevant.
Okay, thank you.
George?
Yeah, hi, Holly. Yeah, very good presentation. I agree. 2 questions. So is this financial plan, does it include the electrification costs of the bus fleet? That's number 1. And I think the other question I have is if, like, how does this plan or some other plan, whichever plan, how does it relate to the ongoing fare study that RTD is conducting? So in other words, if you change fares and, you know, your boarding numbers go up or down, whatever, is that being factored into this calculation, and how? Thank you.
Yeah. So electrification, no. In aspirational, we have included funding for electrification of the fleet. But given that we couldn't afford even really the growth in services or the growth in demand in that fiscally constrained, it was not included in those. Now, there are, just as a caveat to that, there are a bunch of programs coming out, federal programs coming out that are supporting electric vehicle transitions or zero emission bus. It's not always necessarily electric. We often call it electric, but there's a variety of technologies. And RTD is actively looking at those. So while it's not explicitly included here, those grant programs are being sought after to support the transition to electric, zero emission bus kind of fleets. And then how does it, your other question was, how does it address the fare study? Alyssa, you might want to pop in with a little more detail, but because the fare study wasn't complete when this was being put together, we had some fairly conservative fare estimates on a per passenger basis. So we do adjust the amount of money coming in over time based on the number of riders on the system. But given that the fare study is likely to reduce that fare that's coming into RTD, we kept it pretty smaller and conservative. Alyssa, do I have that right? Anything you want to correct there?
Yeah, Holly, that's how we handled it. And, you know, the direction that we took it in is we looked at what the average fare collected per person is based on, recent information, keeping in mind that each rider does not pay the same fare depending on the kind of pass and that kind of thing. So we looked at that at an aggregate level for each mode because it does vary a lot across the modes. And then, in the past, RTD's fare policy has been, I believe, a 10% increase every 3 years. We went with about we assumed half as much growth in the per person, collection of fare, just to kind of be conservative, and we don't want to assume that trend is going to continue because there is pressure to not continue to grow fares and even to possibly go fare free. So that was how we dealt with the uncertainty based on what we know right now and the fare study that's ongoing.
Holly, this is Bill. I did want to add, and I know that Doug and Todd are I think on the call and they could add to this, but I know as part of our mid-range financial plan, which this, effort or financial modeling is built off of, there is an assumption of reduced fare revenue. So there is not, it is an assumption that there, as part of the fare study, that there will be less revenue or fares will go down. So that is built into this analysis.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Kent, looks like you had a question.
Yeah, so under aspirational, are you completing the fast tracks at all or just in doing improvements to the existing rail system?
The aspirational scenario assumes the completion of the full program of fast tracks.
I would suggest that be noted there as fast tracks completion then, just so that so that it's clear, because light rail capacity versus commuter rail, and by just saying fast tracks, you've said completion of it.
Okay, will do.
Thank you.
Okay. Now we're on to another favorite topic, greenhouse gas. Oops, wait a minute. I see another hand, I think.
Yeah. Hi, Holly, that's me. Before we jump and move on, I just had a clarifying question. So I think it was Bill. He said within the fare and equity study, the goal is to reduce fares, and then that's incorporated into this scenario. Is that correct? I just want to make sure I heard that correctly.
Not quite. I mean, our goal isn't to reduce fares. Our goal is to make it more affordable. Now, that may result in reducing fares. It also deals with we have three goals with the fare study: equity, affordability, and simplicity. And so it relates to those goals. What I'm saying is there's an assumption right now in our mid-range financial plan of less fare revenue. And so that's built in. So as we come up with recommendations in the fare study, if our recommendation is to reduce fares, We will then look at how that compares, and Doug and Todd will have to make adjustments to the mid-range financial plan in the future based upon the recommendations of that study. So it's not, our goal isn't to reduce fares. Our goal is to improve access, improve equity, and make it more simple, which could result in fares. It might not either, because there may be scenarios where we actually don't end up reducing the fares. Maybe it's through other means, through discounts, through past programs and other things.
Perfect. Thank you for that clarification.
All right. I think Michelle Bina, if she's out there, is going to step us through our greenhouse gas discussion.
Okay. So just to preface this, I think there's been some questions about how much reduction in GHG can these different, transit possibilities result in. So I thought let's first start at looking at some high level, like by the numbers, travel statistics in the region to get a sense of what trip making is like out there or will be out there in about 2050. So these are some numbers for on an average weekday in the future in 2050. There's about 15 million trips by any mode, 13 million trips in motor vehicles, 2 million by walk and bike. Keep moving on. So like 9 million vehicle trips, and then a significant amount of congestion and delay. So the point we're making is that by various modes, we're talking about trips in the millions. And when we look at future scenarios, we've done some baseline information of projections for what things would look like with transit in like a Dr. Cog type constrained environment. And we also looked at some scenarios that have a very, very high transit investment, where we've assumed a whole bunch of additional BRT routes, the full build out of all the fast tracks. And even with that full network build out, we even doubled the frequency of all of the routes. So we're saying like kind of at a maximum vision of what could possibly happen for transit. How does that impact GHG? And I'll give the punchline here is that it doesn't move the needle on GHG. It only reduces GHG by about 0.5%, all other things being equal. So I understand that's a very underwhelming number. So the point of these next slides is to kind of walk through how some back of the envelope calculations to kind of gut check yourselves and understand why this number is so low, considering just changes in transit service plans. So looking here at these numbers, we kind of look at a base year, existing kind of conditions, and then a 2050 baseline scenario. So, we've talked about vehicle trips being in the millions, and here are vehicle miles traveled, 85 million to 125 million in the future. And we have in 2019, like 390,000 boardings, and baseline 585,000 boardings. So this is just boardings. Because of transferring, we have to reduce that to what are the actual number of trips that people are taking on transit. So we assume 1.4 boardings. So now we're talking about 200 to 400,000 trips, much, much smaller than the millions that we're talking about by other modes. Go next slide. If we assume that the average trip on transit is about 8 miles each, then we have about 2 to 3 million miles that people are traveling on transit, which is about 3% of the miles that people are traveling in vehicles. Next slide. So if we were to say, we're increasing transit by a lot, we're shifting modes, shifting people out of their vehicles and into transit, taking those vehicles off the road. It's not a straight one-to-one substitution of those miles, because you and your family might take transit to downtown to Coors Field or something like that. And so that's 4 people times the amount of miles that you're traveling on that bus versus just one vehicle going those same number of miles. So it's not a one-to-one shift. And because you have to take it into account carpooling and then the people that have changed from bike and walk to transit. So you're not actually taking vehicles off the road. So if we assume 1.8 miles for each vehicle mile, we cut that down a little bit more. Now we're talking about like 1.5% of the total VMT. And next slide. And so under that high scenario that I talked about, with the crazy amounts of investment in the transit network and then doubling the frequency across all of the routes, we increase boardings, we increase the number of trips, person miles traveled. And so we can see from 1.5% to about 2% of the total VMT. So we're only increasing or taking off about 0.5% of the VMT. Next slide. So what are the GHG impacts of that? GHG and VMT are about a 1-to-1 ratio, all things being the same. So meaning that like even with these like very, very big changes in transit service, we may only see about a 0.5% reduction in GHG. And that I think the point here that I'm trying to make is that changes in transit service alone will not solve the GHG problems, because it's just you're serving such a small number of trips when we look at the region as a whole. But we do want to make a few points. So we've seen in like Dr. Cog's scenario analysis that in their scenarios, when they've combined changes in land use and transit service and various policies that would disincentivize the driving, that's when they see the best reductions in VMT and consequently GHG. Also, we know that conversions of the personal vehicle fleets to EVs will have a huge impact of GHG for VMT. So we just want to note that while transit might not solve the GHG problems alone, it's an important part of the solution. So it provides those additional mobility options for those that might not have a car available in the future. If you are striving to reducing that VMT, the number of vehicles that are on the road, and we need those robust options to be affordable, and that transit serves an incredible group of the community, and the equity implications of transit are still very important, and also improves the resiliency of the transit system to have those increased mobility options. So I don't want to make sure that like those points are not lost, as transit is an important part of that solution. So any questions?
Thanks, Michelle. Michelle, can you, for context, give us, and maybe Ron, this might be for you, when we're talking about that 0.5% potential reduction and impact on GHG, I mean, it's not enormous. It's not as much as perhaps we'd hoped, but can you give us some context on what Dr. Cog is trying to achieve holistically when we look out to 2050 or to the state's desired goals?
Holly, I wasn't sure if that was a question for me or somebody else.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Michelle might have it too, but I was thinking you, Ron, I was trying to put the 0.5% in context of what we're trying to achieve at Dr. Cog and within the state as far as the greenhouse gas reduction holistically.
I'll make a couple points. Thanks, Holly, for the question. A couple points I think are really important. First of all, we're probably looking, it's a little tough to quantify specifically, but I think we have pretty good information that we're essentially striving for about a 10% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions beyond our currently adopted RTP, which is a pretty aggressive plan for the region and was just adopted last year and already, like as we've talked about, included a significant investment in developing the beginnings of a regional bus rapid transit network. And so was already a pretty progressive and pretty ambitious plan and important, right? And important investments in a multimodal network consistent with our goals. And so we're looking for about a 10% reduction further reduction in greenhouse gas emissions beyond that, from that. So every bit of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions is important. And as was stated, transit is an integral and very important component of our regional multimodal transportation system for getting people around and moving people around the region. All people of all levels of means and abilities. But the more important thing is that in some ways it is an important mechanism for helping us achieve other outcomes for the region that have also impacts on helping us achieve our climate goals and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and addressing congestion. And that is the leverage between certain transportation investments and transit services and land use and development patterns, and how those two play together, because you can't think of those systems independently of one another. And so that's how we amplify if you just hold everything else equal and you think about just the straight greenhouse gas emissions potentially reduced from a transit system and transit investments, you amplify those greatly by using those investments to help support different land use development patterns that then also further reduce travel by vehicles and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's a very complex system that all has to work together.
Yeah, right. So doing them in isolation, as we've done just for this exercise alone, and I know you all have done the land use connection to it, is probably the point. So the 0.5% is probably not totally fair.
It's misleading.
Yes, in that we need to have a broader context. But for this study, that's what we have to work with. And really, 0.5% of 10% reduction is actually, if you can hit it, it's a good chunk.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a lot of trips that people aren't making, which also, in a private, typically single occupancy vehicle, right? And so that's a lot of trips. That's a lot of reduced conflicts between vehicles and bicyclists, pedestrians. Look, the whole thing is important, and I'll just say it again, just to emphasize it again. It's a complex system. All the pieces have to work together, and I wouldn't want anyone walking away from this discussion thinking it's a waste of resources to invest in transit, or transit is so meaningless, because it's not. That's a lot of people that we move around this region that might otherwise not be able to access their daily needs.
Right. Yeah, that's really helpful. Okay, thank you. And thank you, Michelle. Does anybody have questions for Michelle on the numbers she just presented, or any clarifications that you'd like to take away from that? Okay, let's go ahead and move into this next section. So this next section, when we were here, when we were all together last month, we provided a list of objectives, a list of strategies, and then some metrics on how we would evaluate if we were headed in the right direction on that objective or not. And so we wanted to just go back to that a little bit more, because this is really the crux of this project, is what strategies and next steps is RTD taking now that we understand the picture. We understand more about greenhouse gases from Dr. Cog and from Michelle's team. We have information on some scenario planning to understand how much money it will cost to do some of these, and what we have to work with if we don't get additional money, which is not a lot, right? So moving into the next slide, just as a refresher, we put together these vision statements that are on the left, and we reviewed them with you all. And thanks to those of you who provided some feedback on the strategies in that Survey Monkey we sent out. That was helpful. So we have the vision statements on the left. We have the objective statements in the middle, and then we have some draft metrics. It's all draft really, but draft metrics on the right for how you know if you're pointed in the right direction. So this is really just more of a refresher than anything. We took some of this information to the board of directors, and then the next slide, I think, provides us some information on what we learned, and Julie is going to help step us through these next several slides.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Holly. So, you know, the previous slide, that's the detail that we talked about before. And that is very important. We're still very open to feedback on that. We had a wonderful opportunity on the 15th to meet with the RTD board. And so obviously we didn't have time to go through all of that detail. So what we tried to do is say, okay, from our policy leaders, you know, from the RTD's board perspective, rolling all this stuff way up, what do we really see as three of the major policy concerns, our policy issues that have sort of bubbled to the top as we've done all this analysis and all this outreach. So we had a great discussion with the board on the 15th. The three things that we presented them that we have raised up were these. So the one aspect was that the board has varying perspectives on goals for how and where to provide service. There's not, from the outside looking in, there's not a clarity on why do we put this route here or this route here, increase frequency here, or don't increase frequency there, sort of thing, that there's not a real clarity on that. So we raised that as one potential policy issue. The other is the information we just went through with you that, as Holly said, when we started this project, I don't think any of us thought the financials were going to fall out the way they did, but it's important information to know that short term, you know, when you take the short term and you extrapolate it over the long term, there is a substantial gap in funding. And I know for several years, we were all sort of hoping, well, you know, the bonds would pay off, there'd be a lot more money, we can complete fast tracks. We now recognize, doing a really detailed analysis, that we're still dealing with a substantial gap. And really what this all means is there's a gap between the clarity on policy on how and where to provide service, and the funding challenge has really resulted in sort of a gap in expectations. There are a lot of people looking at RTD providing these such essential services throughout the region. And there's challenges out there because that level of expectation, depending on where you sit, it's not really been clearly addressed, and it's put pressure on the system, on the board, and, you know, and the different groups that we've worked with. So the next slide, I'd like to talk, this is the feedback we got from the board during the meeting. Let me be clear, this is not board action. This is not board consensus. This is just the input we received, because we had a nice opportunity to really have a good back and forth and really get a lot of the board's perspective. So I think the one message we got as the project team loud and clear was there's a real interest in pursuing additional funding, that we all recognize where RTD is now. And when you look to the long-term from a funding perspective, it's not getting us where we want to go. So looking at that, looking at all aspects of potential funding, not just sales tax, was one of some of the feedback we got. There was a lot of discussion, which is great, about how this is a regional issue, that, you know, some of the conversations we've had throughout the couple of years here is, this is all working, you know, this has to work together as a region. And there was some board discussion about even potentially holding some sort of summit to pull people together to do some sort of brainstorming to really develop and continue working with those partnerships across the region. Prioritizing service to equity populations definitely got a lot of support from the board. However, we're back to that issue and challenge of how do you balance taking care of the densely populated areas of the region versus some of the areas with less dense populations, and a lot of discussions around equity populations, gentrification. How do you get, we've all agreed that these are the communities we need to serve, but how do you serve them if they're not in dense areas or if they're in remoter areas? So in this need to, you know, provide service throughout the district. And you guys are very well, we've had a lot of conversations along those same lines. Focusing on GHG, a lot of support for partnership programs, and you know, a desire to do a little bit more communications around this to set some of that clarity. So next slide, please. So that's what we heard on the 15th. So just as a reminder, and this is what we've spent our time on. So what we'd like to really brainstorm with you guys, it's a really hard question I'm about to throw at you. So we know that long-term, the financial projections have limited to no capacity to meet a lot of the expectations and desires of the stakeholders and the customers of RTD. We all want to grow bus and rail service. We all want to, you know, make substantial capital improvements, you know, and construct and finish fast tracks. You know, we all want that. So what we received from the RTD board was, like I said, a preliminary interest definitely in looking at, sort of growing those funds. However, this is where I want to get into a real conversation. How do we do that? If you go to the next slide, this is our question. So if we, and I'm interested in everybody's feedback on that, if we agree as a group that we want to make a recommendation that RTD needs to obtain additional funds, because if we don't obtain additional funds, we can't address the GHG, we can't address the fast tracks, we can't address the capital expansion, the electrification issues, all those wonderful things that we want to do. However, we have challenges right now politically. We have challenges in terms of perception around RTD. And so if we're looking forward at potentially, and we'll use sales tax as a knowing that we're going to be looking at it broader than sales tax, that is the project team's recommendation, again, because of the sheer numbers we're trying to achieve. How do we obtain regional support? If RTD has to go to an election to de-Bruce, if RTD has to go to an election to grow sales tax, how, given the political climate and the perception issues we have right now, how do we do that? And so I know this is not an easy question we are throwing out to you guys, but we'd love your perspectives from where you sit on any suggestions on how RTD can begin the process. A, do you agree that RTD should ask for more funding? So that is a question. And B, if that is what you agree, how is the best way to do that? How can we structure that? What is it that RTD could do now to make sure that happens? So it's just a small little easy issue. I'm just throwing it out there, but I would love, love, love any perspectives that you have. So I guess we'll start with the easy one. In general, do most people agree, or do you agree that RTD should be seeking additional funding? Is there anybody that does not think that is the case, that RTD should maybe just live within their means? David, please, thank you for jumping in.
I want to break your question into two pieces because it's a difficult question. So absolutely, I think RTD should de-Bruce right now and forever. That's the easiest thing to do. It's not enough money to get to the Dr. Cog scenario number 2, but we absolutely need to do that. It's no new taxes, but it's revenues to sustain RTD and keep it together. So that's a yes. I have to think a little bit harder about where do we go? Do we go as far as a 0.5-cent sales tax on all that?
Mm-hmm. We'll keep thinking. I know Mike has some ideas. Let's hear it.
So I think, given the dust up over, finishing fast tracks and promises unkept and all those things, I think it's politically unrealistic for RTD to ask for de-Brucing more funds by itself. So I think the only viable way I can imagine going to the voters for more money is if the governor, the state legislature, leaders from around the state go to the people of Colorado for more money for transportation. Mm-hmm. And RTD is a piece. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think it works for RTD to do it, because I think too many people will say, why would we give you more money? You didn't finish fast tracks, or you haven't kept your promise, or we think you suck. And so I think RTD needs friends. And I think CDOT and the governor's office and the state legislature and the metro mayors and it has to be the big tent. If RTD is going to go, it has to be a piece of a much larger set of questions about the future of transportation for the state.
Great. Thank you for that feedback. Absolutely.
I'd love to hear from others on what they feel about that, as opposed to RTD going with their own ballot initiative to get additional funds. Should RTD's next step be, because one of our first recommendations right at this moment, the way they stand right now, is to de-Bruce and to go after at least that. Perhaps it should be part of the larger picture at the state level. So I'd love to hear from people. Support. I like it myself. It's a sort of a different angle on it.
Or does anyone have a different perspective?
I see some in the chat here.
We got some agreements from agreements from Phil and Ken. Think we're heading in the right direction with has to be a larger coalition. Sarah.
Great, thank you. I agree that I think it'd be tough to go back to the voters to look for additional sales tax revenue. Even before the pandemic, most of the communities and counties throughout the entire RTD district were donating to the base system into areas of higher density. And the SOP, at least in my community, is going to be delivering even less service, about half pre-pandemic. And I think it would be very difficult to ask our voters to pitch in more money if we're not sure it's actually going to serve our community, and especially our equity populations, the ones that need service the most. So that's just perspective from where I'm sitting.
Mm-hmm. So is your thought, Sarah, that RTD shouldn't pursue additional sales tax then? What are you kind of thinking is the best path forward?
I don't think it's realistic. I think if a sales tax measure for transit were to be pursued, I think communities might be more interested in pursuing that for themselves and delivering service themselves. Maybe leveraging that money to partner with RTD for specific services, but already in my community, we are getting less than half in the pandemic. Before the pandemic, we were donating to other communities, and we will be increasing our sales tax revenue. And if we were to increase that to RTD, that just means that money's just not going to our residents. And I just don't think that will be a realistic answer for many of our residents that need transit and are asking for it now and they can't get it.
Right. So what about that local RTD's request potentially at a larger level, or as they continue to operate the backbone network, paired with a local ask, Sarah, for your residents to provide that local service so that RTD would not be doing that anymore? RTD focused on the regional backbone, local agencies providing local service. They get their own, perhaps, funding coming in.
If that question's at me, I think that might be a more acceptable solution, knowing that their tax revenues are coming back to their community to serve their needs.
Okay,
great, thank you. David, you had your 5 minutes to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll agree with Mike Hughes and many others. I think for at least the foreseeable future, it will be very difficult politically for RTD to have the support to go it alone and increase taxes above detabering, debrucing. Through many of these meetings, we've also talked about a lot of partnerships. So I want to sort of second Sarah's comment that after Mike Hughes's big tent idea, as we recreate the gas tax and something else, and we get to a broader transportation tax, RTD may be a partial beneficiary of that. And I still don't think, you may still not get to the level that RTD needs to complete some of these. And so the local level funding, the local partnerships is what I think it's going to take. And people will be able to see the better, greater connection between the tax dollar that they paid and the benefits they receive.
Right, thank you. Kent.
Yeah, piggybacking onto Sarah's comment, I think that it'll be very hard to get a sales tax passed that would go to RTD or any tax. Debrucing might be a little easier sell, I'm not certain. But if you're actually asking cities to partner with RTD, I think what they will want to do is bring in kind as opposed to give them money. And they would rather work to have a transit system that would piggyback into RTD. That's just my 2 cents, because they can control the dollars, and for that amount of money raised, they'd rather spend it locally than put it into a regional pot that has not kept their promises.
Great, thank you for that feedback. So it sounds like there's a couple options out there. We're talking about sort of an umbrella, or maybe this is the same option, an umbrella transportation funding that ties in a lot of different partners and a lot of different key pieces. RTD is a piece of that, or, and correct me if I'm wrong, I want to make sure I'm hearing this correctly, or an approach would be some sort of transit, specific funding but RTD being limited on what their piece of it is, to Holly's point, that regional backbone, and then the rest of the funds actually going toward specific, geographic areas and more community level service. Am I hearing that correctly? So please correct me if I'm wrong. Oh. Michelle, you had a comment in the chat. Would you like to talk about that in Lafayette?
Sure. Sorry, trying to find the mute button.
Oh, I know. It always is a challenge.
I think I was just said Lafayette has a really similar situation to Broomfield.
Mm-hmm.
In past history, it's really hard to augment RTD's service when their backbone is cut down to like 30 minutes to an hour. So if that service has to be like a backbone like service on 287 or Highway 7 has to be at some kind of 15, 20-minute interval where it's really hard to connect to it on any kind of regular basis. Otherwise, you're dropping somebody off and they're waiting for up to an hour.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not like a fatal flaw, but it's just something that would need to be worked through if we're going through how do we have other districts or agencies that are providing service that work with RTD to augment it.
Mm-hmm. So your point is it really has to be a robust regional service if that's going to be RTD's sort of primary focus, because then it makes sense to connect into that system. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you for that feedback. Other thoughts on this easy little softball question that I threw out to this group? Other thoughts? Phil.
Well, thank you. Appreciate the chance to chat on this a little bit. I was thinking about the only thing that RTD really has going for a vote and an increase in taxes is there's a lot of new population, right, that doesn't understand what we kind of went through in 2004 and what's going on since then. But I think there's enough people left that will share the information if RTD does go to a vote. I think we talked early on, and this is back, pre-pandemic when we first started all this. It's about those idea about, I can't recall the exact name, but it's really that idea of subregions putting together. And it goes back to what Sarah was talking about and what Ken's talking about. And I think Mike and David even, it's just the idea that we need to probably take over this local system as localities and really make it our own and tie into an RTD regional transportation district, regional transportation system, and follow that Seattle model or whatever the models are out there that really provide some of that institutional knowledge about how you can build that type of system and grow it to a different looking thing than it is today. And I think that's the way you're going to move forward. It's going to be very tough otherwise, I believe. But we need to change the paradigm. We need to change the discussion. It's not going to move forward as is because we're just locked in up here at least. I know it's not true for the entire district, but you know how it is up in the northern reaches of Boulder County. Nobody's happy. I've been playing with the SOP plan or the system optimization map here, and it's very interesting, but it still shows that there's no rail penetration into Boulder County. So, and do we even want that in Boulder County anymore? I don't know. It would be worth the discussion and the surveys and all those different things to kind of see what's going on and see if there is a new population out there that just doesn't care and just wants better transit. But I'm guessing there's still a lot of frustration. I know there's a lot of frustration up here, but I get a very micro look at the world from up here. So thanks for the chance to speak.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, thank you for that perspective. Other thoughts on this? I apologize, I'm going to get a cough about the cough.
Phil, I love that perspective. And I wanted to take that opportunity to look, one of the other things that I think Reimagine needs to at least touch on, right? Like we've been sort of in and out. And when we started Reimagine, the board had just recently, I think, signed a resolution saying that, you know, they're committed. It was going to be a long ways out, but they were committed to finishing fast tracks. And so we've sort of been on that path. And I guess I would like to hear from this group, what, understanding the financial situation, what are your thoughts on fast tracks? This is a big, and the completion of fast tracks. And I hear you, Phil, and you know, there may be new people that don't even know the history. Maybe they don't have any idea. There may be people now feeling like, that's not even what I want in my community. I want this other thing because pandemic has changed how I travel and the patterns I make. I mean, I think there's a whole slew of, and then there's people that are absolutely frustrated and feel like, you said you were going to do this, go finish it. I'd love to hear some other perspectives. And from us as a technical working group, what thoughts do you want to share with the board of directors and with RTD around this topic?
Mike, go ahead.
So I just feel like at this stage, so much time has passed, and the world has changed in so many ways that for RTD to throw itself on the sword of we have to finish fast tracks no matter what is really preventing the state and the region from having a conversation about what's next. And so we have spent a decade looking backwards because there was stuff that was unfinished. And I get that for the people who were at the end of the list, it's pretty hard to let it go. So I'm not underestimating the magnitude of the ask to simply say, you know, we don't live in that world anymore. It's time to stop dragging ourselves backward to something we thought we were going to do 20 years ago or 15 years ago. We have to go forward. So what does forward look like? What does it look like for Front Range Passenger Rail? What does it look like for RTD? What does it look like for CDOT? And what does it look like for the cities and the counties? And who should do what? And who wants what? And what's next? And so I understand the political power of not letting go of a promise unfulfilled, but it is an anchor. And it is forcing groups like this one to look backwards and to not reimagine. To not look forward and say, well, things should be different and responsibility should be allocated differently and money should come from different sources and the use of that fund should be something else. And I think we're anchored and looking backwards. And I don't think that's any way for us to get where we need to go.
Thanks, Mike.
David?
Yeah, I'm gonna in many ways echo what Mike said. As long as we continue to look at our financial picture as a zero-sum game, we're not going to get anywhere if finishing one part of fast tracks or delivering more service to one part of the region is taking somebody else's slice, you know, making somebody else's slice of the pie smaller. We have to make the pie bigger. It has to be a positive sum game, to use some phrasing that a colleague of mine used. I think in that regard, going after the federal state partnerships for intercity passenger rail money, going hard for that is one of those solutions. We should do everything we can to do that. Originally, Amtrak thought they were going to get all that money, but IIJA sent that to FRA because I think the thinking was it didn't want to presume that Amtrak would operate every new intercity passenger rail service. And so this is an opportunity for all of us to grow the pie.
Great, thank you, David. About some other folks we haven't heard from. I know this is a tough discussion, but you know, we've been at this for several years. We're kind of down to the elephant in the room in terms of how do we move forward. And this is your opportunity to share. And to Holly's point, this is the information we'll be sharing directly with the RTD board. What messaging would you want them to hear? George.
Was there any discussion or ideas about like A-line is a PPP, right? So in investigating if there's an opportunity to, have that kind of setup for additional lines or services and such.
I mean, I think RTD has certainly looked through the years at additional opportunities for public-private partnerships, but it's a way to structure things. It doesn't bring free money into the system. The money that the private sector brings in accelerates things up front, but it still has to be paid back over time. So it's not a magic bullet. It still has to be worked into the financial plan. It still has to be paid for. And so I definitely think that's something. I don't know if we evaluated as part of this study, but I know in the past RTD has done some pretty extensive evaluations on public-private partnerships. But again, there needs to be funding to support those.
Right.
And just to add to what Julie was saying, I think the one thing that's a little different from, the A-line and the G-line or the Eagle project is there was a significant infusion of federal money into that project that really accelerated it. And as a result of the public-private partnership, that was an incentive that we had from the federal government to do that. But with the remaining fast track corridors, they are not in the league of qualifying for that federal funding. And so it's a real challenge for us to look at that as an option under that kind of situation.
Yeah, they don't have that level of ridership. The ones that are at the end, as Mike said, the end of the list or whatever his term was, were the ones that had the lower projected ridership, which is why they were towards the end. They were harder to fund all along because of that.
Exactly. And for the A-line, we got almost $1 billion of federal funding to help support that. So that was a large infusion to make that project work for sure.
Yeah.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, this is a tough, definitely a tough conversation to have for sure. And the team is wrestling with what the right, it's something you kind of can't remain silent on in Reimagine RTD because of just how I think if you were flush with money, you might almost be able to and just not worry about it. But where we've landed in the financials just precludes us from not saying something. And I guess I want to make sure that it is saying something meaningful and that represents what is coming from the group here and that we have heard from the constituents. It's so sensitive. I do please share. And if you don't want to share it here and right now, or you want to think about it and send me an email, I would really appreciate it, because I think this is one that it's a real challenging issue to address in the project.
Absolutely. David? Sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry, Bill.
No, I'll let David go. I was going to kind of ask a question.
Also relating back to Ron Papsdorf's comments, we believe that many of the 11 BRT corridors in the region are eligible and competitive for small starts funding. So we should, as a region, be going hard after those numbers. The BRT corridor connections could improve the viability of some of the ridership on some of those corridors.
Great point. Thank you, David. Absolutely. Bill, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask two questions. One, we are going to have this same conversation with your policymakers tomorrow. So any advice from you all, and that would be great, just because we know that this is even a more challenging conversation with them because of the expectation, the politics and everything else. But two, maybe more importantly, we, at some of the discussion of the board was how do we take this conversation forward? Some of our board members were suggesting a summit, some of it, how to, as a vehicle or a means to continue the conversation. I would ask this group, given this kind of conversation that we're having right now, which I think is great, and it's the realistic conversation that we need in terms of, what's next as we finish up Reimagine. How does this conversation continue? I mean, what you've talked about that, our RTD going out by itself, or RTD kind of is not the right way. And I think most of us agree with that. We've always thought that would be very difficult. But how do you expand that conversation? There's been conversations going on in this region for a long time. You know, and not to put, I mean, another example, I know that we just heard recently that, you know, like Boulder County is having a recent conversation about sales tax and what they're going to look at. And they've come to at least the preliminary realization that they're going to go after just kind of continuing with the same old tax that they had and not increasing it. So some of that conversation is happening. But I guess that my question to you all would be, given this conversation that we've been having today, how does this advance? What's the right way to recommend that this kind of conversation continue to advance so that we can come up with some of these solutions that you guys are discussing and throwing out?
Mm-hmm. Great. Kent?
I think that this is a policy decision, first of all, so you're asking technical to weigh in on that. And so I think your elected officials tomorrow will give you a different perspective, probably. I believe that if we truly aren't going to move forward with fast tracks, or we think there's a different vehicle that needs to happen, then it needs to go back to a vote of the people to say we're not going to complete those fast tracks and be upfront about it with them. Now, that said, then you need to have something to go in place. For instance, RTD's already bought the inline rail from the UP and so why not look at a bus rapid transit along that alignment that would be buses only, that sort of thing. But if you're not look at that, then you need to know what the costs are and ridership, et cetera, and then tie in down to the station that's already existing. Might be a way to move forward on that, but that would also be true with the other lines that need to be completed or extended that were in fast tracks. I'm not suggesting that as a replacement, but I think that question needs to be asked if we truly believe there's a different format that needs to be followed, right? And on that, so but I truly believe that you really have to ask the people, are you willing to not build what was promised? And so that'd Kent, be your best survey.
Yeah. So Kent, your suggestion there really is, if I'm hearing this right, to Bill's question, is really around doing some analysis that's talking about, okay, if it's not this, this is what it could be, like sort of replacement or cost implications kind of, and then of course your discussion about being transparent, I guess, about it, just to make sure that people understand.
Yeah, I think if we're truly not completed in the next 40 years, then let's tell the people it can't happen unless we do this or this. And are you okay with not completing it? That's question number one on a ballot, and let them vote. And two, what's the replacement if we don't do it? Mm-hmm. Does the sales tax go away? What's being given back if you're not going to do it?
Right. I'm almost in.
Because if you're not going to reduce the tax, but you're not do away with what was promised, then I think they're not get told no, build it.
Right. I'm almost envisioning a table, Kent, of like you know, here's what the ultimate fast track commitment is. It could be built in this year, or you could do these, you know, 3 things as replacement or whatever in these years. You know, it's like you're understanding like what your trade-off would be and understanding that.
That could be part of it, yes. But I think it's ultimately have to go back to the voters since it was voted in to begin with, if you're going to change what you're doing.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks. Sarah?
And my comment was really similar to Kent's in that we probably have to go back to the voters if anything were to be changed. And going back to your other question about additional sales tax, I just think if RTD goes out to the public and says, you know, we're just not going to complete fast tracks, and then comes back for another sales tax, and that's definitely dead on arrival. So if you want to be strategic about how we're going to be raising revenues, then we need to be strategic about how we're changing directions and what will be delivered realistically.
Absolutely, that all ties together. We recognize that's all one, very complicated conversation. Absolutely. Brian?
What we all are struggling with, obviously, in the transit profession is, the transit profession has endured a black swan event. There's no question about it. We've probably accelerated telecommuting patterns by 10 years. Jarrett Walker made a comment after reading an article in The Atlantic about everybody talking about bringing back the riders. And I thought Jarrett was spot on. He said, you know what? You got to look at what it's going to be, not what was, because we know those riders, a lot of them, they are never coming back. Now, can we get new and different riders? Absolutely. But I think we've got to focus, and Reimagine RTD thematically will be urging follow-up actions that say, hey, what will be? What is the transit ridership going to look like on the horizon year? We've all noticed vehicle mile traveled has already surpassed the pandemic. Air travel has completely caught up and surpassed what it was before the pandemic. I bet you cruise travel is going to catch up even pretty soon. But if you look at transit agencies across the United States, and there's data out there now that you can look at, it's not happening. Now, will it happen over time? Absolutely. Is it going to be the same as it was in 2019? No. So collectively, as soon as we accept that and act accordingly, we're going to be on the path forward, I think, to address all these kinds of issues.
Thank you, Brian. Mike?
I want to, as a perfect segue from what Brian just said about, trying to figure out what the future is after, the world turned upside down. And really, I want to try to offer Bill Soroy an answer directly to the question about what do you say tomorrow to the policymakers. If you all haven't seen the film Everything Everywhere All at Once, I recommend it highly. It's a great, weird, amazing piece of art. And I think, Bill Soroy, my answer to what you do tomorrow is to help the policymakers grapple with everything everywhere all at once. And what I mean by that is transit isn't about transportation. It's about housing. It's about economic, how people make enough money to, be able to buy a house and keep body and soul together and do the things that they want to do, send their kids to college. And so I think there has to be a recognition, not only of the change in transit, but of so many other changes. And, we live in a region that is tens of thousands of housing units short of where we need to be to balance supply and demand. Now, a lot of that is on its way, though there aren't enough staff in the planning departments to be able to, or building departments to be able to process all the applications. And there are big projects that are planned, in my part of town and in Denver that I know about, a 35-story building in Arapahoe Square, 7 towers on what used to be the Bed Bath & Beyond in Cherry Creek, big stuff. And so we have to figure out a way to economically house the people who want to move here and the families that are forming here, because we don't want them to have to leave. And so what kind of transportation are we going to need to serve the population that is coming in the next 50 years? And it won't look like fast tracks. It won't. It's something else. And it's lots of different things that we have to turn our attention to. And so I think the policymakers have to grapple with housing and air quality and greenhouse gas emissions and all of it, everything, everywhere, all at once, and put the future of transportation in that context, as part of a gigantic whole, and then ask, what should transportation be doing and what part should RTD and CDOT and local governments and everyone else play as we try to actually have the transportation future we need.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. Again, gets back to that. This is a complex system with everything relating to everything. Absolutely. Danny.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you know, and this is probably a question. I mean, probably a point more. I mean, really good discussion, and this is so complex. But you know, going back to some of the RTD board discussion, you know, looking at the scenarios for the, you know, the potential for the future, whether they were funding or what have you. I mean, and then in light of all of these, whether you want to call them new forces or disruptors, I mean, everything from COVID to cost of living to, I mean, we have so many new things, new people who have moved in, just the growth. I keep going back to, I mean, somewhere in here, and at some point, just more, there might be some need for some more detailed market research on preference and needs within the region, whether it's polling or really trying to get down to where are people at. You know, we have feelings and, you know, we have perspectives on it, but maybe it's this is that time to really push out, push out and get something that's I mean, really good data on who are the consumers here, what are they wanting, is there a willingness to pay more, what are those, and maybe there will be a viable financial or funding option that could be identified through some of that too, if that's the case, because there's just so many factors, and you know, maybe that's the time to kind of think about putting this out. So
that's a great point. Thank you, Jamie. Other thoughts? I like Bill's framing it. How would you recommend we present this to your elected officials tomorrow? Any other thoughts? I think Mike had some good points on that. Any thoughts on this?
I'm going to jump in since nobody had their hand up.
Please, Andrew. Great.
Yeah. Hi. So yeah, echoing everything, and what this is all, my comments are going to lead to is kind of that statewide option that I think David was sort of leaning into. And I really like the idea of the big tent. I think that's really what this is going to take. You know, Mike's point on development is dead on, and it's not just in Arapahoe Square with one tower, it's happening all over. Golden Triangle is going to add, you know, 4,000 people in the next 5 years. Rhino is, you know, has what, 12 cranes up right now, building housing and office space. You know, all of that demand, all of those people are going to move here. And if all of a sudden they can't get around, they can't go across town to grab a burger, or they can't go to the grocery store without having to, you know, own 3 cars for their household, they're going to leave. And all of the things that we've all been working for will be for naught. We will certainly go the way of other Rust Belt cities very quickly. It won't take long for cities like Austin and others, Nashville, who are now investing. Just now, they're starting to invest in transit, starting to prove to people that they can provide some of those connections and solve some of those transportation problems. So for me, it's about affordability, but it's also about space. It's about, you know, how we get a lot of people to live in tighter clusters. And I get it. I hear all of the regional woes that, you know, people have been donating to transit. I get it. And people out in rural areas need a lot of space, and they have a lot of space to grow. We don't downtown. We can't afford to grow our roads. And I think for policymakers, to the question of policymakers, I would tell them that there have been very vocal and pretty clear policies that say, from CDOT all the way down to local government, that we aren't going to expand our roads anymore. And specifically in Denver, and I'm sure it's other places as well. So how are we going to move all those people? If we aren't going to expand roads, how are we going to move people? It doesn't matter if they're going to be in EVs. It's not a problem about GHG. We know transit isn't going to solve that problem. So it's about space. All that, the figure that stood out to me most, I think, in the discussion on GHG was the person trip delay. It was like 250,000 hours or something like that. That blew my mind. That is a lot of wasted time. That is a lot of wasted time with your family, with your friends, making, doing your business, starting a business. So I just think we need to lean into this idea that if we're not going to increase space for cars, which is a good idea, it's a good decision. Regionally, we've made that decision. We have to increase space for something else. We have to put it towards something else.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andrew. That's a great perspective. Absolutely. We have a few more minutes. Any other advice? Tomorrow should be an exciting meeting. As to Holly's point, if this isn't something you think of a different idea or you don't want to approach it here, feel free to follow up with us individually. Because this is an important conversation. We feel like, the couple of years of work that we've done to get to this, we're still needing to resolve this pretty significant issue. So we really appreciate your perspective on it. Thoughts?
I appreciate everyone's input today, and do keep it coming as you leave the meeting. I always feel like I think of things after I'm away, so do send stuff along. I have often good conversations with Mike post meeting time when he is brainstorming and has another idea. So I appreciate those, and I think you've had a lot of great insights. Sebastian, can we go on to the next slide? I wanted to show people this is also a link. I wanted to show people what the mobility plan for the future, the digital deliverable, how it's coming together and what it looks like. And of course, we're not going to go over to the black box, which is kind of funny and ironic that it's the black box on the right, because the recommendations are not in there just yet because we're still having these conversations here. But I did want to show you how this is working. What you'll see is that, and this is on the link that we sent you in the email from CEO Johnson. So you can click on any one of these boxes and you can see sort of the order that probably makes the most sense to click through them. But here you can see Sebastian has clicked on the future of transit market and demand analysis, and it takes you through little information on what we've done as part of that. If you click to the next one, maybe go into scenario planning. That's a good one. So scenario planning will take you through the scenario planning exercise that we did and the findings and what came out of that scenario planning exercise. And you can go around this whole wheel, if you will, the whole transit map. Some of the maps, this one is particularly interesting. The travel demand modeling that was completed for the mobility plan for the future. Then you can click on this EMAT modeling tech memo, and you'll see the detailed information that went into what the EMAT tool was and that sort of information. So there's a lot there. It's still very much a draft, and I'd love some feedback from you all on, as you click around, are you able to follow the structure? Does it feel like it's going to be a useful tool once all the recommendations are in there? Is it easy to get around? Do you feel like you know what's happening? Or if you have suggestions on what might work better. So we're pretty excited about it. It's the first time we've delivered in this particular format, and I think it's going to be nice and user friendly. It provides you all the detail that would be sort of in an appendix in those tech memos, but provides a pretty high level synopsis of what the reader might be particularly interested in on that first page as well. Okay, so let's see here. If we want to go to the next slide, Sebastian, that would be great. Julie, do you want to take us through schedule and next steps?
You bet. I think this is it. We're wrapping it up. Really our next steps are to take the information from you, formalize the recommendations that we're going to be taking to the RTD board. We did send out the same document that you had. So we are interested in initial comments from you, from the board, from everyone on the tool that Holly just showed us. We're hoping to get those comments here by July 8th. As we mentioned earlier, July 13th and July 26th are when we will be taking the final draft SOP and taking it to the board for their consideration and hopefully approval. And we will also be providing on July 26th, the mobility plan for the future, the final document. And then we are talking about doing a final get together, maybe even face-to-face as a thank you to you guys in August. So that's, and then we'll be wrapping this up. So with that, we've got a couple more minutes if anybody has any additional questions.
And does anyone have thoughts on a face-to-face meeting? I feel like now hybrid meetings are so challenging, but then virtual is easy, face-to-face. Does that sound good, or does it sound like, oh, that's a lot of work? I don't want to do that. Any feedback on that? No thoughts. If we send it out, you'll show up.
And we will provide food.
We'll give you snacks.
Does that help with people's interest?
Phil says he'll take the bus. Thank you, Phil.
Yeah, face-to-face.
All right, face-to-face. We're going to try for face-to-face in August. So keep a lookout for that.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your feedback. Thank you for all of your several years of support, sticking with us through this. I know it's been a lot. George, did you have a comment for us?
Yeah, actually, I just put the question in the chat. If you can answer, when, like after the board say approves the SOP, what is your timeline for implementation?
So it's going to be implemented through the 3 times a year service change process between now and 2027. And it has to be sort of implemented based on how RTD is addressing their workforce challenges. So as you know, they've made a lot of steps in the right direction. So as we get additional workers, they can add additional routes. And so it'll be phased over time between now and 2027.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, with that, thank you so much. We appreciate your time and look forward to seeing everybody in August.
Yes, thanks everyone for the dialogue and the feedback. Much appreciated.
Thank you.